Welcome everybody to part 2 of our gas drilling awareness series here in Newfield, sponsored by your Newfield neighbor group PAWS, which is People Against Unsafe Sources of Energy. My name's Marie Terlizzi. I'm one of the members, and I'm going to be handling introductions and questions and things tonight. Before we get into tonight's program, I have some announcements. First, the restrooms, for those of you who've never been here before, are through that door over there and right on your left. Second, there's going to be a question and answer period, but we ask that you hold, Dr. Barth welcomes your questions, but we ask that you hold them if possible till the end of her talk when there'll be a designated period. We also ask that you try to keep them relatively brief and to the point. If you're like me, you forget things. You maybe have so what we've done is we have some scrap paper on the back table there by the door and some pens. If feel free to get up and take one, a piece of paper and a pen, if you want to jot down anything that comes to mind during the talk. And do return the pens at the end, please. And now the other thing is Dr. Barth has she's got several interesting articles that she's written, all of them relatively recent. There's samples on the back, but these are just individual copies. If you think you want one, we have any one of them or all three of them. We can sign up there on one of those clipboards that says sign up here for Dr. Barth's paper, and we will email them to you. And that way we're all saving paper and trees. And the other thing about papers, we didn't record Dr. Ingraffea's talk last week. It was really well received, but I have his PDF of his PowerPoint, and for those of you who are coming next week, we're going to put together like some highlights of his talk on probably on one piece of paper, and we can either pick it up in person or we can email that to you too. Also in the back, there's a volunteer sign-up sheets as you're leaving, if you feel like you want to help out in some way with future events that PAWS puts on, please sign up before you leave. There's also, we're going to pass, probably between Dr. Barth's talk and a question and answer, we're going to pass around clipboards too, where you can sign up for information about future events, because we will be probably in July. We're thinking about having some other kind of events. So if you want to be notified of future events, you can sign up for that on the clipboards that come around during the talk. And finally, there are costs associated with putting on these speaker series and events. So we are going to pass a basket around probably right before questions, and we thank you for anything you're able to contribute towards the cost of these events. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. We're very pleased to have with us Dr. Jannette Barth, who's an economist, and she's going to discuss the economic impacts of gas drilling in the Marcellus, and particularly the question of whether will there really be net benefits. She's going to get into some of the talking points of the gas industry. She's really well qualified to do that for us tonight. Dr. Barth is president of J.M. Barth and Associates Incorporated, an economic research and consulting firm. She's also the founder of Pepacton Institute, LLC. That's on her slide there. She has worked in the fields of economic analysis and econometric modeling and forecasting for over 35 years. She received her BA from Johns Hopkins University and her MA and PhD from the University of Maryland. Several of her former positions include chief economist for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority and consultant and account manager for Chase Econometrics and Interactive Data Corporation. Dr. Barth's areas of concentration in graduate school and beyond have been econometrics, public finance, and industrial organization. She has evaluated economic decisions using various techniques, including econometric modeling, input-output analysis, and cost-benefit analysis. She has applied these techniques to various industries and has experience in both the development and evaluation of a wide variety of economic models and analyses. Dr. Barth has taught economics at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. In recent years, she has been able to combine two of her great interests, economics and fine art, by becoming a consultant to attorneys and appraisers in art valuation and by serving as an expert witness. She's a strong supporter of sustainable economic development and volunteers much of her time applying her knowledge and experience to environmental and economic development issues. And as a landowner in Delaware County, New York, in the Marcellus Shale region, Dr. Barth became interested in the economic and environmental impacts of gas drilling using hydraulic fracturing techniques after reviewing the existing studies of economic impacts of gas drilling in New York, including the treatment in the draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement produced by New York's Department of Environmental Conservation. Dr. Barth authored a summary report, Unanswered Questions about the Economic Impact of Gas Drilling in the Marcellus Shale. Don't jump to conclusions, and that's what we're going to be hearing about tonight. And a final, very important point, her work in this area and all this work that she does in economic analysis of drilling in the Marcellus Shale is entirely self-funded. So please welcome Dr. Barth.
Can you hear me all right like this? Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak here in Newfield. It's my first time here. I had not too much trouble finding it. I first started hearing about gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale about 3 years ago. I heard concerns about the environmental impacts and public health impacts. And I also heard grandiose claims about the economic benefit that would come to the region. Well, as I'm an economist, I decided to go ahead and read all of the economic impact studies that were written. And that's how I got involved in this issue. I'm sure by now you've all heard about the risks associated with hydrofracking for shale gas. I list some of them briefly on this slide. Water contamination, including contamination of groundwater, aquifers, and private wells. Air pollution, involving carcinogens and other toxic chemicals. Sick and dying animals, including wildlife and livestock. Wildlife in Wyoming has been found to have disappeared in areas near drilling, and cattle in Pennsylvania have been quarantined after drinking brine from the wastewater. Human health impacts. The chemicals involved can cause cancer, brain damage, birth defects, neurological problems, and respiratory problems. And many of them, such as birth defects and endocrine problems, may not surface for many years. I encourage you to see the extensive work by Dr. Theo Colborn on the health impacts of some of these chemicals. Another risk is the creation of an industrial landscape in place of our tranquil, rural, peaceful areas here in upstate New York. I understand Tony Ingraffea was speaking to you last week. I had heard him estimate that if we allow the Marcellus Shale play in New York, there may be as many as 8 wells per square mile over 70% of the region. I assume also that you're all aware that since 2005, hydrofracking has been exempt from the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other federal acts intended to protect the environment. And I'm also quite sure that you've heard the industry state repeatedly that this type of drilling is safe. They have even repeatedly stated that there have been no cases of water contamination. This is absolutely not true. A report by Riverkeeper cites more than 100 cases across the country where federal and state regulators identified gas drilling operations as the known or suspected cause of groundwater, drinking water, and surface water contamination. In Pennsylvania, state regulators have found contaminated drinking water, polluted surface waters, polluted air, and contaminated soils. The Monongahela River and the Susquehanna River have both been affected. And I'm sure you've read the reports about the blowouts and the spills that have occurred in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania alone, there were over 1,400 industry violations in a 2.5-year period, and there have been multiple violations in other states as well. So you may ask, why take the risk? There are two reasons usually stated. First, industry claims that natural gas is a clean fuel. Industry also claims that gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale will result in a great economic benefit to the region. It looks like in reality that natural gas is not such a clean fuel. The EPA, the Tyndall Center for Climate Change, and Robert Howarth at Cornell University have all three independently come to the conclusion that the production and delivery of natural gas likely emits more greenhouse gases than the production and delivery of oil, and far more than coal. Dr. Howarth specifically concluded that between 3.6% and 7.9% of the methane from shale gas escapes into the atmosphere in venting and leaks, and methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. Professor Kevin Anderson of the University of Manchester, home of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change in the United Kingdom, said, and I quote, "If we are serious in our commitment to avoid dangerous climate change, the only safe place for shale remains in the ground." The second reason given to make it worth taking the risk, with possibly irreversible environmental and health degradation, is that gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale will bring great economic prosperity to upstate New York. I know that upstate New York, and particularly the area on top of the Marcellus Shale, has been having a really tough time economically. I think everybody's aware of that. And I'm the first to want to help any struggling farmers, anybody else who's struggling. The fact of the matter is that shale gas extraction may not be the solution to the problems. In fact, the region may be worse off economically in the long run if we allow drilling. So is the potential economic gain worth the risks? I have reviewed the frequently quoted economic impact studies, and I'm going to explain to you tonight why the conclusions tend to be exaggerated. First, a warning. We've all heard numbers like 150 or 200 or even up to 400 jobs created per well. Please remember that when you hear such numbers quoted, gas workers move from well to well. So these jobs are not measured in what we call person years. Many of the jobs are short-term, many are part-time, and many of these workers are imported from other states on a transient, non-permanent basis. So whenever you hear such numbers quoted, please be sure to look at the numbers very carefully, seek out the sources, and evaluate any potential bias of the sources of those numbers. Also note that when you hear claims of many jobs being created, remember that the oil and gas industry is 10 times more capital intensive than the average industry. So perhaps it would be better for our regional economy, and in particular for job creation, to encourage a more labor-intensive industry. I've included this slide just to give you an idea of jobs that can be created from renewable energy as opposed to oil and gas drilling. The University of Manchester concludes that renewables, while still relatively capital-intensive compared to other industries, they create more jobs than the oil and gas industry per dollar expended. So the economic impact studies. The studies that claim a positive economic impact tend to be either biased, dated, seriously flawed, or simply inapplicable to our region. Studies not funded by the gas companies have reached vastly different conclusions than those funded by the gas companies. The studies that I reviewed are from 5 regions. In New York, I looked at the Draft Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Study and the Broome County Study. In Pennsylvania, I looked at 2 studies out of Penn State and a third one funded by the American Petroleum Institute. Also in the Marcellus Shale, there was a study of West Virginia, and in the Fayetteville Shale in Arkansas, there were 2 studies out of the Business School funded by Southwestern Energy and some other gas companies. In Texas, I looked at a study referred to as the Perryman Study. It was done by the Perryman Group. And finally, I looked at a study of Western states by a firm called Headwater Economics. There's also an academic study that I'll mention. So first, the SGEIS. It was released by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, in 2009. The economic analysis portion included in the SGEIS is from 1988. Yes, 1988, that's 22 years old. No responsible decision maker should rely on an economic analysis that is 22 years old. Simply too many things change. The SGEIS ignores the possible declines in other industries that may result from both pollution and a shift to an industrial landscape. These industries include agriculture, tourism, organic farming, hunting, fishing, and river recreation, all industries that are currently important to our region up here. A thorough evaluation would include impact analysis of the potential declines in all of these industries. The SGEIS also ignores other significant costs. For example, it recommends that 150 new tasks be assigned to the DEC, but the cost of staffing these additional tasks are not reflected in the analysis, and I'm sure you've all read that the DEC has been cutting staff. The SGEIS itself references other flawed studies, one of which is the Broome County study. The Broome County study was commissioned by the Broome County Legislature. The Broome County study ignores declines in other industries. Again, industries like tourism, agriculture, organic farming, sport hunting, and fishing. A major food cooperative in New York City that purchases millions of dollars of New York State-produced agricultural products has stated, and I quote, "Our members will not want the fruit and veggies that come from farms in an industrialized area. And they're concerned about whether the cows they buy were drinking contaminated water and breathing the air fouled by numerous enormous trucks that will support the hydrofracking process and the hydrofracking process itself." The Broome County study also ignores very relevant and very significant costs. There'll be damage to infrastructure, especially roads and bridges. At least 1,000 large truck trips per well will be required. And by the way, be skeptical of claims made by the gas industry that they will repair all of the roads. In the tiny, tiny town of Cochecton in Sullivan County, New York, when the Millennium Pipeline went through, there was between $1 and $1.2 million worth of damage to the roads, and the pipeline company said that they would cover it all. In the end, the community only got $125,000 from the pipeline company for road repair. Oh, and speaking of road damage, it's recently come to my attention that in the Fayetteville Shale region in Arkansas, where I note there is a severance tax there and has been for a while, the Arkansas Highway Department said that the gas industry has caused $455 million worth of damage to highways. Highways, that's state highways. That doesn't include city and county roads, so there'd be a lot more damage than just $455 million. Arkansas added a specific amount, I don't know exactly how much they added, but they added a percentage to the severance tax to specifically help pay for the road damage. But in 1.5 years, they only collected $36 million. So the taxpayers of Arkansas will have to make up the difference, which is more than $400 million. Back again to the Broome County study. The costs of drinking water contamination and land, stream, and air pollution are ignored in the Broome County study. The cost of mitigation is ignored, and so is the cost in terms of health. Again, various contaminants in the fracking fluid and the flowback fluids are endocrine disruptors and carcinogens. The economic costs of treating birth defects and serious diseases are not reflected in this study or in any of the other economic impact studies. The study also ignores declines in property values. Supporters of gas drilling say that property values will increase. This is a major unanswered question. Rental rates will probably increase due to the influx of transient workers. Hotel occupancy rates may increase, and we have seen this happen in Pennsylvania. The value of large tracts of land may increase, but single-family homes and small lots will probably decline in value. Reports indicate that some banks are not giving mortgages for properties with a gas lease or even properties nearby a gas lease. And how do you sell a house if your water's contaminated or if the buyer can't get a mortgage? Also, I've heard insurance companies are refusing to issue policies on homes with gas wells. It was reported in Wise County, Texas, in the Barnett Shale, the Central Real Estate Appraisal District. They decrease values of homes by 75% if a gas well sits on the land. Let's look at the economic reality in New York. While I'm the first to admit that there are many, many factors that may distinguish one county from another, I decided to look at some of the measures of economic health in gas-intensive counties. I looked at actual data for the top 10 gas-producing counties in New York State. This is, of course, conventional vertical drilling. And I admit the results might be different if we look at much more intense drilling that would happen with hydrofracking. But anyway, I looked at conventional drilling. I looked at the period from 2006 to 2008, and I compared the top 10 gas-producing counties in New York State to 5 neighboring counties without any gas drilling. The gas-intensive counties are not better off than the non-gas drilling counties. They're not better off when you look at the number of families below poverty level, the median household income, or unemployment rates. And by the way, I'm not the only one that's concluded this. You may have heard of Susan Christofferson, Dr. Susan Christofferson at Cornell University. She's a professor there, and she's doing a study not funded by the gas industries, and she reviewed counties both in New York and Pennsylvania and came to the exact same conclusion that I did. Let's move on to Pennsylvania. I grouped 3 studies together here. They have the same primary author, Tim Considine. The first 2 came out of Penn State, where he worked at the time. They were both funded by the Marcellus Shale Coalition, which is a coalition of gas companies. The third study was funded by the API, the American Petroleum Institute, which is also a trade association. And that study came out after the author had moved to the University of Wyoming. So the first 2 were out of Penn State, the third from the University of Wyoming, all funded by the gas industry and all with the same author. Now, all 3 of these studies are likely to be biased, as they are all funded by the industry, and the industry provided the data. And it appears that the industry has been exaggerating its estimates of gas production expected from shale. Arthur Berman, a petroleum geologist and a financial consultant to the energy sector, has shown that the decline curves for gas extraction in the Barnett Shale and the Fayetteville Shale are much steeper than industry claims. This basically means that the vast majority of the gas is produced in the very first year or possibly 2 years. So the years of production per well are fewer in reality than what is assumed in the economic impact studies. Deborah Rogers, another interesting analysis. She's a financial expert and a former member of the advisory committee for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. There's a lot of drilling down there. She states that based on historical production data, the average Barnett Shale well life is 7.5 years, not the 30 to 40 years as originally projected. She also says that reserves may be overestimated by a substantial factor, possibly by as much as 300%. And she says the gas companies may have borrowed a huge amount of money based on reserves that they cannot pull it out of the ground at a commercially viable cost. And she says that, quote, some analysts have gone so far as to liken this to the mortgage-backed securities bubble. So if assumptions of levels of gas production and the number of years of production are overly exaggerated, and those overly exaggerated assumptions are put into an economic model, then it's only logical that the results that come out of the economic model, such as employment levels, income levels, and tax revenue, will also be overly exaggerated. Again, like the studies I mentioned before, the Penn State studies and the API study ignore the important economic costs, such as infrastructure damage, water contamination, and other pollution, and declines in other industries. The studies all take a very short-term view. What happens to the region when all the gas is gone and we may be left with contaminated drinking water, pollution, an industrial landscape, and a population with failing health? The studies don't go out that far. And note that all of the flaws that I mentioned in these Pennsylvania studies also apply to the Arkansas Fayetteville Shale study because they copied the approach from the Penn State studies. And the more recent West Virginia study that I looked at also share some of these flaws in that they use a technique called input-output analysis. They all use that, which I'll get to later. And they base their data on a survey of the gas companies. So the data is provided by the gas companies. I do give the West Virginia people credit for at least listing some of the things that are not reflected in their studies, both positive and negative. And they even mention the serious environmental risks. They don't try to quantify them, but at least they mention that they exist. Some of the other studies just ignore them completely. The West Virginia study authors, they also confirm that the natural gas industry is known for hiring out-of-state workers. I mentioned input-output analysis. It's also referred to as IO analysis. It's the technique used for most of these economic impact studies that have been funded by industry. I don't want to bore you too much or get too academic with this, but I think it's important that you know a few things about this technique. What is input-output analysis? Well, it's done using a matrix with rows and columns of input-output coefficients. It shows how the output of one industry is spread across other industries as inputs. So it's also called inter-industry analysis. Vital to this type of analysis is an understanding of how the inputs and outputs are linked, and these links are measured by what they call input-output coefficients. Bear with me. The coefficients typically used are provided by the U.S. Department of Commerce. There's a section called the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And by the way, one of the preeminent scholars and proponents of input-output analysis was one of my main professors when I was doing my PhD. So I know a little bit about input-output analysis. It's a great tool. It's extremely useful in many, many situations. But with all economic models, the practitioner must be very careful and knowledgeable to be sure that the results are realistic and as accurate as possible. So what's wrong with input-output analysis in this context? First and foremost, it doesn't capture any environmental costs. It doesn't capture any damage and wear and tear on roads. It doesn't capture any health effects or pollution. And it also does not capture the negative effects on the other industries such as tourism and agriculture, important industries in our area. Also, an input-output model assumes that all populations have identical spending patterns. This exaggerates economic impact if new workers are transient and non-permanent, as is often the case with gas drilling. These transient workers are sending their wages back to their homes in other states, so they're not getting spent here. So the spending is totally exaggerated in the region using these input-output techniques. Input-output assumes constant returns to scale. This would mean that the gas industry, a large industry, gets no volume discounts. I think that's unrealistic. These models are always static. They take place at one point in time, and they're aspatial. Now, this simply means that it's not reflecting, it means that the coefficients don't change over time at all, which is unrealistic. And it also means that transportation costs are not reflected, which is also ridiculous, especially when you consider all these trucks and the pipelines and everything else involved in the transportation sector. But perhaps the most important concern in this case, using this type of technique, input-output analysis, is the fact that the coefficients are unknown. One cannot know what the true coefficient values are in a case where the industry does not already exist in a region, such as horizontal drilling and hydrofracking in upstate New York. We just don't know the coefficients for a new industry like that. There are a number of other ways why this technique is not appropriate, but I'm not going to bore you with all of them. Let's move on to the economic reality in Pennsylvania. Many gas industry workers in Pennsylvania are from out of state. Some reports say as many as 70%, and now I've seen more recent reports claiming 30%. I think, and I'm trying to verify this, the 30% figure is based on a recent survey of drilling companies actually in Pennsylvania. And I don't suppose they'd have a reason to exaggerate, right? I don't know. And the industry does claim that they're committed to hiring local workers. Now, an Oklahoma paper reported that many gas companies are using dormitory-style housing because most workers are from outside the area, spending 2 weeks on the job and 2 weeks off. And we all know that recently Chesapeake built exactly such housing in the Marcellus Shale area in Pennsylvania. So I ask, why are they building dormitory-style housing if they're committed to hiring only local workers? The Marcellus Shale Coalition, a lobbying organization for the gas industry, frequently quotes the Penn State study and claims that 88,000, they claim, new jobs have been created in Pennsylvania in 2010 due to Marcellus Shale drilling, they claim. Publicly available Pennsylvania state data show that total job creation in the state, the entire state, was only 65,600. And half of these jobs were in either education and health or in leisure and hospitality. So the grandiose job claims are from data provided by the industry, and they are not at all consistent with data from unbiased, publicly available sources. I visited Bradford County fairly recently. I spoke with a bunch of people, and I toured the area to see the gas drilling sites. I really recommend that you all do that if you can. It was interesting. But I was told by a county commissioner that Bradford County was advised by a team of academic sociologists and they told him that 80% of communities with gas drilling are worse off in the long run. So Bradford County now wants to be one of the 20% that is not worse off in the long run. Who doesn't, right? But it takes very careful planning and proper regulation and policy making. It would require a significant slowdown of drilling activity. It would require a slowdown in both the pace and the extent of drilling activity going on in Pennsylvania now. I think they got started too fast and too furiously to really be one of those 20%. I hope they do well, but it doesn't look likely to me. Anyway, I was told also that the people in Bradford County feel that their community is being treated as a throwaway community, and they use that term, throwaway community, for the benefit of the oil and gas industry. And I really don't want to see that happen to our communities here in New York. Let's move on to Texas, the Barnett Shale play. Supporters of natural gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale often point to the success of the Barnett Shale play. There's only one economic impact study of the Barnett Shale play that's frequently quoted. It is the Perryman study. And I've been developing economic models for a very long time, as was said in my introduction. And I would never, ever submit a report without clearly stating my data sources, describing my model structure, and showing tests of model accuracy. The Perryman study fails on all three counts. It doesn't make clear where the data come from, and it actually claims that their econometric model is proprietary. Kind of like those chemicals in the fracking fluid. So I simply cannot trust this study until more information is provided. But even if Texas has experienced a significant positive economic impact, it doesn't mean that New York State will. Comparing the economic impact of gas drilling in the Barnett Shale to gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale is like comparing apples to oranges. The labor force in Texas has the requisite skill set due to its long history of oil and gas drilling there. Rural counties in upstate New York have to import much of this labor. We saw that Pennsylvania has imported up to 70% of its gas drilling labor force. The imported labor is often temporary and transient, sending most of their income back home to their families in other states, maybe Texas. Texas has a huge support industry network for oil and gas industry activities. It, of course, has all the requisite machinery and equipment, much of which is distributed, contracted for, repaired, and serviced, all in Texas. New York State doesn't have gas company headquarters. They tend to be headquartered in other states like Oklahoma and Texas. And the Barnett Shale is in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. It's a dynamic urban region with all the affected industries ensconced there. This is very different from rural New York. In fact, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex may actually be a good place to use input-output analysis because the coefficients would be known. The industry's been there for a long time. Also, Texas has a warm climate, so as landowners become rich, they're likely to stay there. Who knows if our landowners are going to stay in New York? We don't know that if they become rich with this. We just don't know that. So it's quite possible that Texas may derive a greater economic benefit from gas drilling in New York than will New York. And by the way, when I said this to an audience where there were a bunch of Texans in the audience, they stood up, they were outraged. They said, but we have all the drilling in Texas, and we're really not doing great economically either. So there you go. Economic multipliers. Nobody likes to hear about these, but they're frequently mentioned. So I think you should all be aware of a few general known facts about economic multipliers. Multipliers are larger in more developed areas with industrial diversity. This is certainly true of the Fort Worth area, but not true of the Catskills and the rest of rural New York. Multipliers are larger for areas with a labor force who has the requisite skills. Again, this is true of the Fort Worth area for gas drilling, hydrofracking, but not in New York. Multipliers are larger in areas where permanent residents are the workers. True again in Fort Worth in this industry, but maybe not in the Marcellus region of upstate New York. And finally, multipliers are larger for labor-intensive industries than for capital-intensive industries. And I already said that the oil and gas industry is 10 times more capital-intensive than the average industry, so it's unlikely to have a large multiplier. A nonprofit firm out west, Headwaters Economics, did an informative study that was not funded by the gas companies. It analyzed 23 counties, all out west, to compare the economic health of counties that focused on fossil fuel extraction as a strategy for economic development. They compared those counties to counties that did not focus on fossil fuel extraction. It concluded that the counties that were not focused on fossil fuel extraction experienced higher growth rates, more diverse economies, better educated populations, a smaller gap between high and low income households, and more retirement and investment income. And while I'm on the subject of the impact in western states, there have been some knowledgeable people also speaking about community impacts. For example, Jill Morrison of the Powder River Basin Resource Council in Wyoming reported, quote, there have been a 10% to 15% increase in the crime rate in the counties in Wyoming where there have been gas booms. She also said that they had terrible drug problems, particularly with methamphetamines, coming into the counties with the gas booms. These counties have had to increase the size of their jails. These are additional economic costs to communities that are never reflected in these economic impact studies. And for more information, she is featured on a video from the Oil and Gas Summit from November 2010 online. You can Google that and find more that she says about community impact. And closer to home in Pennsylvania, in August of 2010, the Penn State Cooperative Extension quoted Bradford County Commissioner Mark Smith. He said, the things people don't understand are the impacts on volunteer fire departments, social services, drug and alcohol prevention, jails, and state police. He said that 60 to 70 out-of-state gas drilling workers had gone through his county's jail system and that a few extra inmates each month at a huge taxpayer expense to a small institution. None of these things are counted. Another study, an academic study published in 2002, reviewed 301 quantitative analyses in order to determine the economic implications of mining for non-metropolitan regions. It concluded that unemployment and poverty worsened in mining counties in non-metropolitan regions. It found that the highest levels of long-term poverty are in places where there was once a thriving extractive industry. Another study that I referred to earlier is being done by Dr. Susan Christofferson at Cornell. Her research is not funded by the gas industry. It's funded by the Heinz Foundation and the Park Foundation. She says that the gas industry is a speculative, high-risk, short-term industry and that the shale play is likely to create a short-term boom followed by a long-term bust. Note that not only economists and environmental activists are saying this about the economic impact, even investment analysts say that the oil and gas business has a record of booms and busts. Economic development experts all know that this is not desirable for a community. We all know that some gas companies and some landowners would be willing to take the money in the short run and go, treating our region as a bunch of throwaway communities, as was mentioned in Pennsylvania. Nobody at all, including me, disagrees that there will be short-term jobs created. Short-term jobs. They'll include jobs on drilling sites and ancillary jobs, such as truck drivers, welders, road workers, hotel and restaurant workers. We've seen that in Pennsylvania. That's happening there. But the questions are, how many are long-term, full-time jobs? How many are good jobs? How many of these jobs will be filled by local residents? And how long will these jobs last? If our legislators and other decision makers are truly concerned about our health, environment, and our community's long-term economic condition, they should pay attention to the conclusions of independent researchers based on sound methodology and data, and not on researchers hired by the gas industry, and certainly not to selected anecdotal clips of anticipated jobs cited by representatives of the gas industry. These things we're seeing in the paper all the time. Again, independent, unbiased research indicates that there will be a long-term bust, and we may very well end up worse off than we are now. In reality, the only parties likely to benefit in the long run are the gas companies and a few lucky landowners. Here are some of my conclusions. The economic impact studies that conclude a positive economic impact ignore important and significant costs. The economic impact studies that show positive benefits have been funded primarily by the industry. The methodology used is often inappropriate for a thorough evaluation of the industry in this region. The economic impact may not be worth the risk of the potentially severe and, in some cases, irreversible consequences in the form of health, environmental, and infrastructure degradation. Gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale is likely to result in a short-term boom followed by a long-term bust. Beware, gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale may well result in a net negative economic impact for New York. Before I close, though, I want to say that I feel very strongly that New York State should not allow gas drilling unless and until proper planning, policies, and regulations are in place. We are very far away from having proper planning, policies, or regulations. We don't have enough solid, respectable research on the environment, on public health, or on economic impacts. And until we do, New York State should ban gas drilling, if and when such research is done properly and we can be satisfied that there is a safe way to extract the shale gas. Then we would first need a long-term economic development plan in place in order to reduce the negative impacts of a long-term bust. We would also need a tax policy in place that taxes the industry and others making money off of our gas resources. And we need to tax production at high rates from the very beginning of production while production is at its highest. The tax revenue must be used to protect our communities that are impacted and not simply sent to the general fund. We must have accurate monitoring in place at well sites to be sure that we have accurate production numbers and not rely on an honor system of the gas companies to self-report. We must wait for the EPA study, and we must have proper environmental regulations in place at the state level. We must also be aware that communities with the actual wells are not the only communities that will be impacted in a negative way. Nearby communities without gas wells will have related industrial development, such as water treatment facilities, staging areas, man camps, pipelines, and maybe not benefit from a tax. We have to be very careful that these are all planned for the right way. These communities will also have costs associated with heavy industrial development and a long-term bust. And I mentioned pipelines. Speaking of pipelines, we're talking about a vast, vast network of pipelines, gas company collection lines, gathering lines, transmission lines. It's been pointed out in both Texas and in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, that the potential of future development is often destroyed in these communities because building cannot take place on top of gas lines or very close to gas lines. And if we have a spider web of all these small and large gas lines all interconnecting, it could ruin any development for the future. And one fact that many people don't recognize is that small towns are very much more exposed to the economic risk than our larger urban areas. The smaller towns have smaller budgets, smaller taxpayer bases, and very little diversity. And please bear in mind that every new study that comes out has more bad news about the negative environmental impacts of gas drilling, and these are not reflected in the economic impact numbers, including, look for the Cornell study you're all aware of, and the Duke University study. Look for that one too. We are very lucky in New York that we have an opportunity to wait and watch what happens in our neighboring state of Pennsylvania over the longer term before we take any risks. The gas will not go anywhere while we wait, watch, and do thorough research and figure out how to extract the resource safely and in a way that would benefit and protect everybody in the region. And here is my email address, so please email me. That's the end of my talk.